Her life was decided, and she never spoke a word. Two men made the deal. She just stood there. Was this marriage? Or something far colder? No voice, no choice, just a wedding. When we think of ancient Greece, we often picture philosophers debating in the agora, warriors charging into battle, or gods and goddesses weaving tales of epic romance. But what about the ordinary people? How did they find love, choose partners, and build families? Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating questions. In ancient Greece, was marriage about love and romance, or was it purely a matter of social and economic pragmatism? The answer, as we'll discover, is far more complex than you might expect. Ancient Greek marriage customs varied dramatically between city-states, social classes, and time periods. What we find is a society where passionate love existed alongside calculated political alliances, where romantic poetry flourished while marriages were arranged by fathers, and where the very concept of love itself was understood in ways that might surprise us today. To understand marriage in ancient Greece, we first need to understand the society that shaped it. We're talking about a civilization spanning roughly from the 8th century BCE to the 6th century CE, though we'll focus primarily on the classical period from the 5th to 4th centuries BCE, when Athens and Sparta were at their height. Ancient Greek society was fundamentally patriarchal and hierarchical. The household, or oikos, was the basic unit of society, and it included not just the nuclear family but also slaves, servants, and sometimes extended relatives. The head of the household, the kyrios, held legal authority over all members of his family, including the power to arrange marriages for his children. But here's what's crucial to understand. Greece wasn't a unified nation as we know it today. It was a collection of independent city-states, each with its own laws, customs, and social structures. The marriage practices in democratic Athens were vastly different from those in militaristic Sparta, and both differed from the customs in other Greek cities like Corinth or Thebes. This diversity is key to our story because it shows us that even within the same civilization, people had very different ideas about what marriage should be and how it should function in society. Let's start with the legal foundations. In ancient Greece, marriage wasn't just a personal choice or a romantic gesture. It was a legal contract with serious social and economic implications. The process typically began with the engesis, or betrothal, which was a formal agreement between the groom and the bride's kyrios, usually her father or male guardian. Notice something important here. The bride herself wasn't part of this negotiation. The engesis was essentially a contract between two men, transferring the guardianship of the woman from her father to her future husband. The groom would declare, "I give you this woman for the plowing of legitimate children," and the father would respond, "I give her to you." Central to this arrangement was the dowry, or proak. This wasn't just a gift, it was a crucial economic transaction. The bride's father would provide money, property, or goods that would help establish the new household. In Athens, the dowry remained the woman's property in a technical sense, and if the marriage ended in divorce, it had to be returned to her family. But the legal structure went even deeper. In Athens, there were specific laws governing who could marry whom. Citizens could only marry other citizens, and there were strict rules about marriage between relatives. The epikleros system dealt with heiresses, women who had no brothers to inherit their father's property. These women were required to marry their closest male relative to keep the property within the family, regardless of their personal feelings about the match. The legal requirements varied significantly between city-states. In Sparta, for instance, the process was quite different, with less emphasis on formal contracts and more on the physical and military capabilities of the potential parents. The wedding ceremony itself was a multi-day affair filled with religious significance and social celebration. It began with the proolia, the pre-wedding sacrifices to the gods, particularly to Hera, the goddess of marriage, and Artemis, the goddess of childbirth and young women. The bride would undergo a ritual purification, bathing in water from a sacred spring. This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about spiritual preparation for her transition from maiden to wife. She would also dedicate her childhood toys and clothing to Artemis, symbolically leaving her youth behind. The main celebration, called Gamelia, was a feast held at the bride's father's house. Here's where we see one of the most interesting aspects of Greek marriage customs: the separation of men and women even during the celebration. The men would feast in one area, while the women celebrated separately, only coming together for specific ritual moments. The climax was the Pompeii, the wedding procession. As night fell, the groom would come to collect his bride, and they would process through the streets to his home, accompanied by friends and family carrying torches and singing wedding songs. The bride would be veiled, symbolizing her transition from her father's household to her husband's. The procession ended at the groom's house, where the couple would enter the thalamos, the wedding chamber. The consummation of the marriage was considered essential to make the union legally binding, and the bloodied bed linens were sometimes displayed as proof of the bride's virginity. To understand whether love could flourish in ancient Greek marriages, we need to examine the stark gender roles that defined married life. In Athens, married women lived under significant restrictions. They couldn't own property, except for their dowry, couldn't make legal contracts, and couldn't appear in court without a male representative. Athenian wives spent most of their time in the gynekeion, the women's quarters of the house. They rarely left home except for religious festivals, and when they did, they were expected to be accompanied by a male family member or a trusted slave. Their primary duties were managing the household, supervising slaves, and most importantly, producing legitimate male heirs. But here's where the diversity of Greek culture becomes fascinating. Spartan women lived completely different lives. They received physical education, could own property, and had much more freedom of movement. This wasn't because Spartans were more progressive about women's rights. It was because they believed strong women would produce strong warriors. The power dynamics in marriage were clearly defined. The husband was the absolute authority, with the legal right to divorce his wife for any reason, while women faced much more restrictions in seeking divorce. The ideal wife was described by the philosopher Xenophon as one who would see as little as possible, hear as little as possible, and ask as few questions as possible. Yet within these constraints, women found ways to exercise influence. They managed complex households, made important decisions about child rearing, and participated in religious activities that gave them social status. Some scholars argue that the very limitations placed on women created a space where emotional bonds with their husbands could develop, based on mutual dependence and shared investment in the family's success. Now, we reach the heart of our question. Was there room for love in this system? The answer is both yes and no, depending on how we define love and what expectations we place on marriage. The Greeks certainly understood passionate love. They called it eros. Their literature is filled with stories of consuming passion, from the epic love of Helen and Paris that launched the Trojan War, to the tragic romance of Orpheus and Eurydice. Poets like Sappho wrote movingly about love and desire, and philosophers like Plato explored the nature of love in works like the Symposium. But here's the crucial distinction. This passionate love was generally not expected to be found within marriage. Eros was seen as potentially dangerous to the social order, a force that could drive people to make irrational decisions that would harm their families and communities. Instead, the Greeks valued philia within marriage, a deep friendship and mutual respect that could develop between spouses over time. This wasn't the absence of love, but a different kind of love: steady, reliable, and focused on shared goals rather than personal passion. Evidence from tombstones and personal letters suggests that many Greek couples did develop genuine affection for each other. Inscriptions speak of husbands mourning beloved wives and wives honoring respected husbands. These relationships may have started as practical arrangements, but they often evolved into something deeper. Modern research on arranged marriages shows that love often grows after marriage rather than before, and this seems to have been the Greek expectation as well. The marriage was the beginning of a relationship, not the culmination of one. No discussion of love in ancient Greece would be complete without addressing same-sex relationships, particularly the practice of pederasty in Athens. This was a socially accepted relationship between an older man, called an erestes, and a younger male, the eromenos, typically in his teens. These relationships were seen as educational and spiritual as well as romantic. The older man was expected to guide the younger one in matters of philosophy, politics, and social behavior. This wasn't considered an alternative to marriage. The older man was usually married, and the younger one was expected to marry when he came of age. What's fascinating is that these relationships were often described in terms of passionate love, the very eros that was generally discouraged within marriage. The Greeks saw these relationships as natural and even beneficial to society, while viewing marriage as a practical necessity for reproduction and household management. Again, practices varied between city-states. Athens had a well-developed culture of pederasty, while Sparta's approach was different, focusing more on military mentorship. Some cities were more accepting of adult same-sex relationships, while others had stricter age restrictions. Female same-sex relationships were less documented, partly because women's lives were generally less recorded in ancient sources. However, we do have evidence from poets like Sappho that intense emotional and possibly romantic relationships existed between women, particularly in religious and educational contexts. The contrast between Athens and Sparta provides one of the most striking examples of how different Greek city-states approached marriage and women's roles. Let's examine these differences in detail. In Athens, women's lives were highly restricted. They married young, often in their early teens, to men who were typically much older. Their education was limited to domestic skills, weaving, cooking, and household management. They were expected to be modest, quiet, and invisible in public life. Spartan women, by contrast, married later, often in their late teens or early 20s, and to men closer to their own age. They received physical education and were expected to be strong and healthy. They could own property, conduct business, and had a voice in family decisions. Even the marriage ceremonies reflected these differences. Athenian weddings were elaborate affairs emphasizing the bride's transition from her father's control to her husband's. Spartan weddings were simpler, sometimes even involving a ritualistic kidnapping of the bride, but the woman retained more independence after marriage. These different approaches had real consequences for the emotional dynamics of marriage. Some scholars argue that the greater equality between Spartan spouses created more opportunity for genuine partnership and mutual respect, while the power imbalance in Athenian marriages made emotional intimacy more difficult to achieve. Contemporary Greek writers were aware of these differences and sometimes commented on them. Some Athenian authors viewed Spartan women as too independent and masculine, while some Spartan sources criticized Athenian women as weak and overly sheltered. When marriages didn't work out, ancient Greeks had legal mechanisms for ending them, though these varied significantly by gender and city-state. Understanding these laws gives us insight into how marriage was viewed, more as a legal contract than a sacred bond. In Athens, men could divorce their wives relatively easily for several reasons: adultery, failure to produce children, or simply incompatibility. The process was straightforward. The husband would simply send his wife back to her father's house with her dowry. No court proceeding was necessary. Women faced much greater challenges in seeking divorce. They had to petition the archon, a city official, and provide compelling evidence of abuse or neglect. Even then, their chances of success were limited. The social stigma of divorce also fell more heavily on women than on men. Adultery laws were particularly harsh and gender-specific. If a woman committed adultery, her husband was legally required to divorce her, and she was banned from participating in public religious ceremonies. She essentially became a social outcast. If a man committed adultery, particularly with another man's wife, he faced severe penalties, but his own wife couldn't divorce him for this reason alone. Once again, Sparta was different. Spartan marriage laws were more flexible, allowing for wife sharing in certain circumstances and making divorce somewhat easier for both parties. This wasn't because they were more romantic about marriage. It was because they prioritized the production of strong children for the state above individual marital bonds. Despite these challenges, we do have records of both successful divorces and long-lasting marriages. Some couples managed to navigate the legal and social obstacles to end unhappy marriages, while others found ways to build satisfying relationships within the constraints of their society. To fully understand Greek attitudes toward love and marriage, we need to look at their literature and the stories they told about relationships. These sources reveal a complex relationship between romantic ideals and practical realities. Greek tragedies often featured marriages gone wrong. Medea's revenge against Jason, Clytemnestra's murder of Agamemnon, the tragic fate of Phaedra and Hippolytus. These stories served as cautionary tales about the dangers of uncontrolled passion and the importance of maintaining social order. Greek comedies, particularly those of Aristophanes, took a different approach, often mocking marriage customs and gender roles. In Lysistrata, women withhold sex to end a war, highlighting both the power women held within marriage and the absurdity of extreme gender separation. But we also have evidence of genuine romantic feeling in private letters and poetry. Husbands wrote affectionately about their wives. Wives mourned their husbands, and lovers of all genders expressed deep emotional connections. These personal documents show that love could and did exist within the constraints of Greek society. Archaeological evidence supports this too. Joint burials, shared grave goods, and personal inscriptions all suggest that many Greeks found emotional fulfillment in their relationships, even when those relationships began as practical arrangements. We cannot understand Greek marriage without acknowledging its economic dimensions. Marriage was fundamentally a business transaction, with implications for family wealth, property inheritance, and social status. The dowry system meant that families had to carefully calculate the costs and benefits of marriage alliances. A generous dowry could secure a good match for a daughter, but it also represented a significant financial investment. Poor families sometimes struggled to provide adequate dowries, limiting their daughters' marriage prospects. Inheritance laws reinforced the economic importance of marriage. In Athens, property passed through the male line, making the production of legitimate sons essential for family continuity. Women who failed to produce male heirs could find their marriages in jeopardy, regardless of their personal relationships with their husbands. Marriage also created business partnerships between families. In-laws might collaborate on trade ventures, share resources during difficult times, or combine their political influence. These extended family networks were crucial for economic survival and social advancement. The economic aspects of marriage varied by social class. Wealthy families could afford to consider romantic compatibility alongside practical concerns, while poor families often had to prioritize immediate economic needs. Slaves, of course, had no legal right to marry at all, though they sometimes formed lasting partnerships with their master's permission. While we focused primarily on Athens and Sparta, ancient Greece encompassed hundreds of city-states, each with its own marriage customs and attitudes toward love and relationships. In Corinth, for example, the influence of trade and contact with other cultures created more diverse marriage practices. The city's wealth allowed for more elaborate wedding celebrations, and its cosmopolitan nature may have created more opportunities for cross-cultural marriages. Island communities like those on Crete or the Cyclades developed their own variations on Greek marriage customs, often influenced by their isolation and unique economic conditions. Some islands had matrilineal inheritance systems, while others developed distinctive wedding rituals adapted to their maritime culture. Greek colonies throughout the Mediterranean also developed hybrid marriage practices, combining Greek traditions with local customs. These colonial marriages often involved more practical considerations about survival and community building than their homeland counterparts. Religious centers like Delphi or Dodona had their own marriage customs, often influenced by the local oracle or particular deity. These sacred marriages sometimes involved different rituals or expectations than secular unions. To understand whether love could flourish in Greek marriages, we need to look beyond the legal frameworks and examine what daily life was actually like for married couples. Despite the formal restrictions on women's roles, married couples often worked closely together to manage their households. Husbands might consult their wives on important decisions, particularly those involving finances or the education of children. Women's expertise in household management was valued, and a skilled wife could significantly improve her family's social standing. Private moments between spouses were largely undocumented in official records, but we can infer from literary sources and personal letters that couples did share intimate conversations, jokes, and emotional support. The Greek concept of oikonomia, household management, required cooperation and communication between husband and wife. The shared experience of raising children created strong bonds between couples. Both parents were invested in their children's success, and this common goal often brought them closer together. Greek parents typically had deep emotional connections with their children, and this shared love strengthened marital bonds. Religious festivals and ceremonies provided opportunities for couples to appear together in public and share meaningful experiences. These events were among the few times when husbands and wives could socialize together outside the home, strengthening their relationship through shared spiritual and community activities. So, returning to our original question, was ancient Greek marriage about love or pragmatism? The answer, as we've seen, is both and neither. Greek marriage was fundamentally different from modern Western marriage, but it wasn't devoid of emotional connection. The Greeks approached marriage with a realistic understanding of human nature and social needs. They recognized that passionate love could be destructive if it overrode practical considerations, but they also valued the deep bonds that could develop between committed partners. In many ways, their approach was more honest than our modern romantic ideals. They understood that successful relationships require more than initial attraction. They need shared values, mutual respect, and complementary skills. While we might find their gender roles and arranged marriages objectionable, their emphasis on marriage as a partnership with shared goals has enduring wisdom. The Greeks also understood that love comes in many forms. While they didn't expect eros within marriage, they valued philia, friendship, storge, familial love, and agape, universal love. Their more nuanced understanding of love's varieties might actually be healthier than our modern tendency to expect one relationship to fulfill all our emotional needs. What strikes me most about ancient Greek marriage is how it reveals the eternal human struggle to balance individual desires with social responsibilities. The Greeks developed a system that prioritized social stability and family continuity, but within that system, people still found ways to express love, form meaningful bonds, and create fulfilling relationships. Perhaps the most important lesson from ancient Greek marriage is that love and pragmatism aren't necessarily opposed. The strongest relationships often combine emotional connection with practical compatibility. The Greeks understood that while passion might spark a relationship, it's friendship, respect, and shared commitment that sustain it. In the end, the ancient Greeks remind us that there's no single right way to structure relationships or define love. Their approach was shaped by their specific social needs and cultural values, just as ours is shaped by our contemporary concerns. But across the centuries, the fundamental human desires for connection, understanding, and partnership remain remarkably consistent. The question isn't whether the Greeks were right or wrong about marriage. It's what we can learn from their experiences as we navigate our own relationships and social structures. In studying their balance of love and pragmatism, we might find insights that help us create more sustainable and satisfying partnerships in our own time. Ancient Greek marriage was neither purely romantic nor purely practical. It was profoundly human. And in that humanity, perhaps we can find wisdom for our own understanding of love, commitment, and the eternal quest for meaningful connection.